our main shaft. We've got it. It's already been checked for straightness. We've already polished. It's clean. It's ready to assemble. So right now we're going to put a little bit of oil, because you can start at either end of this thing. You can start at the front or the back, because this thing's going to have to load from the flange to the back or the flange to the front, and it's up to you and how you want to do it. Today I think I'll load from the center to the rear, and like I say, it doesn't really matter. So if we're going to do that, we know that this is first gear, this is second gear, third gear, and fourth gear, and sixth sits on the sleeve up here, reverse sits back here. So what we're going to do is load second gear. Once we load second gear, then I can assemble my synchronizer assembly. Then I can load first gear. And remember, this one's got a snap ring. According to our exploded view, this one has a snap ring. So we've got to make sure that we get everything in place so that we don't forget anything. Okay, so we'll start with second gear. And second gear has 2 Torrington bearings and a sleeve. And we'll load this. Sleeve will go in the center. Then another Torrington bearing. Then we'll load our second gear. All right, this is the cone area up here once I load my second gear. Then I'm going to assemble my synchronizer assembly. Then I will get the Bryce. I'll need 2 pieces of Bryce for this assembly, but I'm going to assemble my synchronizer assembly. And I had to have a new slider sleeve for this one, because this one had been abused a little bit going into second gear, and the teeth were kind of a little bit scraped off. They didn't come to a point like they should. So I went ahead and got a new sleeve for this one. So this sleeve is a new sleeve, but based on my old sleeve and the orientation of the sleeve on the hub, I had marked my hub so that I knew the front, and I marked the front, and it will go this way, and we'll put that together. Usually takes about 3 hands to do this. Once I get the keys into place, then I can put the springs in. And you want to make sure that the spring is locked in with the keys. And I've seen these springs put in many different ways. I've run these things for years where the gap is on the same side at the top. Not had any problem. I have run them where the gap was on the top on one side and on the bottom on the other side. And I really don't think it matters as long as you get them in position and the spring is inside the keys all the way around. That is the most important thing. Now we'll get our rice out. It is imperative with this road race brace to make sure that your key lines up with the slot on the brace. If not, you're going to do damage to the brace. So we've got to make sure that that's lined up. And the synchronizer assembly goes on with the cone end down on the back side. So we're going to put that into position. And we know that the snap ring goes in this groove behind the synchronizer assembly. That's why we're putting the synchronizer assembly on next. All right, like I say, you want to make sure that this brace lines up with that key slot in the gear. If not, you're going to do damage to your brace. All right, we've got to go down just a tick further. I can tap this. If it requires a press, press this. If it's loose, it will tap into place without doing damage. We're just about there. And the snap ring looks like it will go. As long as the snap ring will go into place, into position, we should be good. And what I normally do when I get to here is I will use my little screwdriver and just tap gently to make sure that the snap ring is seated. And that the gear will turn and the brace is loose. So now we're ready to install our first gear and our brace ring. So we can put our brace ring in place. I'm going to oil this first. All right, I've loaded my Torrington bearings. I've got my brace in place. That was in place. That's one thing about these. You run out of hands. And also your hands get pretty slick. We want to make sure that we get oil into areas because until this thing, don't know how long it's going to sit, so you want to make sure that all the parts and pieces are lubricated pretty well, because if it sits a while, it could rust. As clean as the metal is, it could rust. All right, that's our first gear in place. And remember, we had a thrust washer that goes next. It goes up against the first gear. And this is a new bearing, and a new bearing for the tail shaft output bearing. We'll have to press it onto the shaft. So I'm going to go to the press and I'm going to press this on. Remember, on the output shaft, the snap ring goes to the outside on both ends. It will go this location, but we've got our first gear, second synchronizer assembly, and our second gear, and the cone is the correct orientation on the hub, and the hub was correct because we marked it to the front. So now we've got it in place. I'm going to press my bearing on, then we'll put the snap ring on, and then I can load the front of the shaft, then we'll put reverse on. All right, we just got back from the press. We pressed our output shaft bearing on. It's pressed on. We have clearance for our gear. And the snap ring is on and in the groove. So this completes the rear of our assembly. And now we'll concentrate on the front buildup of the main shaft assembly. And then we can get this dropped into the case. All right, before we go any further, I wanted to mention to you that there are two different types of brace in this transmission. It's actually, they look the same except there's a slot cut in the brace. You notice the tabs come all the way to the top. 4 pieces of brace will look like this one. 2 pieces will look like this one. It's because of our synchronizer assembly. The synchronizer assembly for first, second, third, fourth is the same thing. So the synchronizer assembly for 5, 6, as you notice, it's not as thick as the ones for the other gears. So there has to be a difference in the build-up stack if the keys are the same width, and they are. All the keys that I've marked in this thing are the same. So there's a difference in the brace. 4 pieces, first, second, third, fourth will look like this, and then 5th and 6th will have a slot because that synchronizer assembly is thinner. It really comes down to the fact that the space in the front, as the gears got thinner, they had to thin up the synchronizer assembly because there's only so much room in the transmission to be able to do this. So we'll save that for later. We'll put this one back into place. And now we'll start with the buildup of our assembly, and that will actually be 3rd gear. I've already oiled the shaft, oiled the bearings, and we have a Torrington bearing, a sleeve, and another bearing. And then our 3rd gear goes on the shaft. All right, that's our brace, correct brace for this synchronizer assembly. The next step will be, now we don't have, even though it looks like we could use a snap ring right here, one does not go there in this particular build for sure. And according to our exploded view, it does not show one either. So the next step is to put our synchronizer assembly on. And it will go, because we had marked this, this is the way it goes to the front. This is the hub's correct direction. The slider is the correct direction. So we can slide that into place, and you just have to make sure that you line these up to where these slots fit into the hub of the synchronizer assembly. You can do damage, real damage to the brace ring if you don't have that in place. So we put that into place, and right now I've got a small tool that I use to bring this down with. I need about 3 more hands. And from the sound of it, it is seated. And the way that we make sure that it is seated. And sometimes you may have to press this synchronizer assembly on. Sometimes they don't go on this easy, and you have to press them on. And that's really when you have to be careful not to do any damage to the brace, because the way that we show it right here, the brace has to line up with the slots in the inner hub. And I'm going to bring this back where you can see what I'm talking about. That brace has to line up just so. And if it doesn't, you can do real damage to these brace rings. Now is the time for our snap ring. And remember that it took us the thicker snap ring. This one is 122 thousandths thick. And this is the step that we put this one into. And you want to make sure before you try that your ring will go into place. If there's room to do this, I like just to make sure and check that to make sure it is enough clearance to put the snap ring on. All right. Snap ring is seated and in place. And now we're ready to put our fourth gear on. Already oiled the shaft. That's our Torrington bearing. It only has one. We have our gear and our brace. And it will line up with the slot and go into place. All right, the next step, we want to make sure that that the gear is below the flange on this shaft. Then that way you know you have clearance with this fourth gear and before we put our sleeve on, because the sleeve has to press off, and we want to make sure that we have clearance before we put this sleeve on, because this sleeve, the backside flange, sits down against this flange of the shaft, and then our clearance comes from the edge of this gear up to this sleeve right here. So we want to make sure that we've got clearance. And with that being done, we can put our sleeve on. And let's see, we'll go this way. And this sleeve is actually, I've got probably about 1/2 to 3/4 thousandths of press on this sleeve. I hand sanded the shaft just a little bit because I want to make sure that I don't have too much press, and I found about 1/2 thousandth to 3/4 thousandth is a good number on getting this thing on and off without doing damage. And you notice that as I'm pressing this thing on, or hammering it on, tapping it on, I hope, is I've got a ledge on this and it sits down on the top of this sleeve, and that way I don't do damage to the sleeve. See if we're coming down. Yep, we're coming down. Everything looks good so far. Like I said, you can tap this on if you've got a way to do this, or you can press it on. And this was for the demonstration. This was easier for me to do. All right, that has seated. I can remove that. And we have clearance with our gear. And pull it out of gear, and our gears turn. So now I can install my 6th gear, which runs on this sleeve. There's a Torrington bearing on the inside, the gear, and remember this brace has the deeper slots in it to line up with our Synchronizer Assembly, which is thinner than the other two. And we can thread this onto the front of the shaft. And remember, like I said, you've got to line up your slots to where that the Synchronizer hub assembly slides back over the tab of the brace. Now that should leave enough room for our snap ring at the front, and then our other sleeve that goes on the front of the shaft. So we'll put this snap ring on first. And it's snapped into place, so that snap ring is on. And now we have our sleeve that goes on. I'm going to put a little bit of oil on the inside of that sleeve. A little bit of oil on the shaft. Tap this just a little bit to start it. And then I'm going to get a piece of aluminum. I want something softer than the sleeve that I'm driving, because I don't want to do any damage to the sleeve. And I'm going to see if I can tap it all the way almost on with a piece of aluminum. All right, I've got my piece of aluminum, and I'm going to use it to go against my sleeve so I don't do damage to my sleeve. And it's back to where the shaft is even with the flange, but the sleeve's got to go back just a little bit further. I found me a socket that will fit this, but the socket is bigger than the shaft on the inside to where we don't do damage to either piece. So I'm going to go back just a little bit further with the sleeve and seat it against the front of the output shaft. Once we do that, we have a brass ring that goes on the input. I'm going to put some oil on this. A brass ring on. We also have a Torrington bearing that is on the inside that mates your input to your output, because these spin at different speeds at times. So we need to make sure that this bearing is good and it is lubricated before we put it together. And we're going to line it up to where the synchronizer hub is lined up with our key and our slot on the front of the input. Once you put that into place, that completes your build of the input assembly and the main shaft assembly. Now we're ready to drop this into our case hive and make sure everything lines up and spins freely the way it's supposed to. All right, I've got my case hive here. I'm ready to drop the main shaft assembly into. I've got the forks in the proper position. I've also checked to make sure that we're in neutral in all three gates down here, and all three shift cams are in neutral. And on the main shaft assembly, all the synchronizer assemblies are in neutral also. So with a little bit of finesse, we should be able to get this in, because we're lining up 6 sets of gears here and the forks all at the same time and then dropping it in. And remember, on the main shaft assembly, both snap rings were on the outside of the case. So I'll just grab my assembly and carefully position this. I've already oiled the forks. Drop this into place, and it's in neutral, so you should be able to hold either input or output and turn the other one. So that assembly works. It rolls over free, and it looks like all of the gears are aligned correctly. So this assembly to this point is ready to check and make sure that we can shift. That's what I love about these split cases, is the fact that we can now determine whether all the gears you're able to shift into each position, because we'll try first gear, second gear, third gear, fourth gear, fifth gear. Excuse me, this will be fifth gear, because I keep forgetting that the lever is going to be turned in the opposite direction. So this is fifth gear, and this is sixth gear. It aligns this set of gears. And also too, at this particular point in time, we can check and make sure that we can't get it into any other gear, that all our detents are in place, and we can't get it into any other gear while we are in 6th gear. So all that seems to be in order. And we should be good.